Thanks very much, Nicole, and thank you so much for coming out this evening. It's my job to try and inform you, and I hope be able to entertain you a little bit. The topic is a little bit of a specialized topic, and it may not be to everybody's taste. On the other hand, I suppose it's something that we should all at least be aware of. So I'm hoping that on the way through here tonight, it is a vast topic. And I'm only supposed to talk to 45 minutes, and I could probably talk for 45 hours, actually, and I probably would do if they let me. But I'm not going to do that for you this evening. So what I'm going to try and do is walk us through some of the big concepts about our food production, some of the areas where we may be vulnerable in terms of looking at how we produce our food and all the rest of this kind of stuff. A few of the common diseases. And some of them, forgive me, they're going to have funny names and this, that, and the other stuff on them, but we can deal with that. I'll try and make them so that you do understand what is going on with that. And then just a little bit on the way through, it's obviously we have to look at how vulnerable is our food, including things like bioterrorism and what have you, which seems to be a bit of a buzzword. I'm not an expert in bioterrorism, though I have some pretty good ideas, but I probably can't say them, otherwise I might be visited by the RCMP or something like that, I don't know. But anyway, please just sit back, and I hope that I'm going to be able to make it worth your while for coming out this evening, and thank you for this. This is such a beautiful building. I've never been in this building before, and it's really lovely. Can everybody hear me at the back okay with this microphone? I hate microphones. I'm probably going to be pressing this a few times instead of pressing this, which actually changes the slides. So if the slides don't move and you realize I'm pressing the microphone, just say press the slide mover on. Everybody wants, and Nicole is no exception, they say, I got to have a title. I said, well, why don't we just say food microbiology or something like that? And she said, nobody's interested in that. Nobody's going to come out. So we come up with this title here, which I think, quite frankly, is maybe a little more scary than it's supposed to be. But she thought it was catchy, and she said, that's what we'll run with. So that's what you got. So the title of the talk is Eat, Drink, and Be Wary. But I'm hoping that you're going to see that in actual fact, so long as we use our common sense and do many of the things that we've been taught what to do, that in actual fact our food is an awful lot safer than we think, though it is indeed vulnerable, and that's one of the messages to get across. So pardon me with these slides, you know, nobody can do this stuff without a PowerPoint these days, it seems, and I hate them. But nonetheless, we have to use them, and it does at least try and keep me a little bit on track in terms of where we're going. So food-associated illnesses. The USA, they estimate about 76 million people per year get some sort of food-associated illness. They get about 5,000 deaths. Australia seemed to do an awful lot better, even proportionally, with only about 5 million people per year that get a food-associated illness and 80 deaths. And the UK, 17 million per year and about 700 deaths that can be directly related to consumption of food that has been spoiled or that they've actually picked up something from the food. Now, I mean, if you actually do some of the sums and what have you, it looks as though there's obviously something wrong with these figures. These actually do come from the CDC in Atlanta, and you can find it on their website. Countries actually count food-associated illnesses in different ways. You often have to estimate what it is that you're dealing with, because after all, how many people who have just a bit of an upset stomach and maybe have a little bit of diarrhea or something for, I really don't want to go to Emerge, I don't want to go to the doctor's office, I'll wait for a day or so and see if it's gone, and if it does go, which many of them do, then it's never going to be reported. Most of these diseases that are reported are because a sample is actually sent to the lab, something is identified in you that is related to something to do with food, it's reported on through to the medical officer of health. They do their investigations. If they think it's associated with food, it gets tagged as a food-associated kind of disease, and that's how the statistics are kept. It's estimated that for every one that we actually get, every sample that we get that actually has something in it, like a salmonella or something like that, that for every one of those, there's probably about another 100 people who actually got that disease, but it was never reported. So some of these things are just based on estimates. So it's a fairly large problem, but it's not huge. But nonetheless, it is significant and something obviously we have to be a little bit careful about. In high-income countries, where do we get these food-associated infections from? Well, catering facilities such as restaurants, cafeterias, receptions, wedding receptions, the picnics that people have, you know, down in the parks and things like that, they account for something in between 20 to 60% of all these kinds of infections. Hospitals and long-term care, 5 to 60%, and that depends just how carefully we, you know, or how little we want to tell people how our hospitals are. I mean, quite frankly, I can't imagine that many people get sick from eating the food in hospital, because have you ever tried to eat the food? I mean, nobody does, so I really don't, I honestly don't know. But once in a while, somebody obviously eats it and they may get sick with it. And as you can see, there's quite a broad spectrum in terms of that. Domiciles, that's just houses. Obviously, and 5 to 30% are actually just from food in the home. And then schools and camps, which of course are always the ones that get the big billing. You know, oh, kids go off to summer camp and they get sick and they write home and say, Mom, I've had diarrhea every day, that, you know, please take me home, and this, that, and the other stuff. But in actual fact, schools and camps are very, very careful, and they really do account for only a small number of these infections. So when you're tracking the source, you need to look at all the points in the food chain. And these are usually, you look at the production. And remember, when we're talking about food, I'm talking about meat production, eggs, all the kinds of food production. And we'll break that down a little bit as we go on. But the food production, and sometimes that's just put in as field and feed. So, you know, if you're feeding something to the cattle or to the sheep or what have you, or you're growing vegetables or whatever it is that you're growing in the actual fields. So that's the first part of it, when we're producing the food. And there are all sorts of things that can happen at that time that may in fact contaminate the food, and it may then lead to some foodborne outbreaks later. Most of the food that we eat now is actually processed, and it's processed, as you're going to see, in fairly large factory-type, industrial-type food processing, and it leads to all sorts of potential issues in terms of that. So we also have to slaughter the animals. Nobody goes, or very few people go out and kill their own, even their own chickens and things like that. And most people, particularly students, it's always funny, you know, you ask them where certain things come from, and they'll tell you that they come from the store, and you say, no, they don't, in actual fact. And I think, you know, if people actually had to go out and kill their own food and what have you, they certainly wouldn't like to do that. And so we put those away in large slaughterhouses and what have you, so they're out of sight and more or less out of mind. But as we'll see later on, I think with one or two examples, there are obvious problems in terms of processing where we can get into difficulties. And of course, you all remember, just not that long ago, there was the difficulty with an organism called Listeria, or listeriosis, that was in processed meat. And again, we'll maybe touch on that. At least we'll touch on Listeria a little bit as we're going in. And then lastly, there's the serving process, which is the cook in the kitchen. And those are the individuals who are actually doing the final preparation of the food, the cooking, the serving, the storing of any of the leftovers, and what have you. So those three major areas are the things that we're going to be looking at and trying to sort of break them down a little bit, where you can begin to see where some of the things in the chain, where there may be some little gaps that would allow stuff to get into our food chain. The emerging hazards that we have with it obviously are the ideas of industrial production. Most of our food is transported huge distances. I mean, you just have to go. I usually go on a Saturday morning with my wife, and we do the grocery shopping, and I'm always amazed. You know, you wander around and you see this is from Mexico, this is from Chile, this is from California, this is from Florida, this is from this, that, and the other. Our food travels huge distances to get to us now. And it's produced in all sorts of different countries under different standards of production. And although we try and have good inspections and what have you, obviously things can go a little bit wrong sometimes. But I remember somebody telling me one time to just have a look and see the difference now in terms of how far our food is from our plate in terms of where it's actually produced. And I said, how do you do that? And they said, well, why don't you go down to the library and go into one of the archives of a local paper and go back about 50 years and find a wedding and look at what was served at that wedding reception, because they actually used to do that in some of the local papers. They would put in that so-and-so and so-and-so got married, there were X number of people at the wedding, and this is what they ate. And it's really fascinating because you go in and you look at that, and what you find is that the people had meat, and usually it was beef, and it's oftentimes, you know, you knew that the beef came from close by, and they would have, if it was in the wintertime that people were getting married, or even in the summertime, they'd have lots of local vegetables and things like that. You wouldn't see things like kumquats and kiwi fruit and this, that, and the other stuff. You know, it was meat and potatoes that people had for these things, and most of it was local. And in fact, it would be about, it would come from usually no more than about 50 miles away from where people were actually living. Most of them got their food. Now the distance that the average amount of food, if you go to a restaurant now, sit down to a restaurant meal, it's about 2,000 kilometers is about the area that you're actually getting your food from. So it's come from fairly long distances to be able to feed us. International distribution, because they come from other countries, they have to be stored, transported, oftentimes from continent to continent. And again, it makes it really, really difficult because you bring all this stuff from these different places. They come into central warehouses where stuff is sorted and then repackaged sometimes and then sent out all over the place. When you're trying to backtrack and try and find out where did that stuff actually come from, it can be enormously difficult because you can get to a certain point and then you realize, my goodness, in actual fact, there was stuff from Florida, Chile, France, etc., actually all in the same shipment, or all in the same shipment that came out to the stores. So you can imagine just how difficult it is to actually get back to the source of where contamination may have taken place. There's a good deal of consumer preference for raw foods. And these would be even things like raw milk. People like to drink raw milk. People think that you know, sushi is very popular. There's a whole host of things, and we tend to like to eat our food. We've been told for a long time, you know, people used to, when they cooked it until it was almost inedible, you know, like hospital food. And of course now, you know, with people take the courses and what have you, and you don't. People like to eat food al dente, if you like, or they don't like to overcook food. Because there's a feeling that if you do, and it's true to a certain extent, you might actually cook out an awful lot of the nutrients in the food if you cook it for too long. And so people have been eating food that is not as well done as beforehand. And then I just threw this in at the end here, because somebody may have a question about it, is the whole idea of antibiotics and things in feed. When you're putting animals close together and you have large numbers of them, the antibiotics, everybody thinks it's actually to prevent infection that the animals are getting the antibiotics, but oftentimes it's not. It's actually to improve their weight gain. But nonetheless, those antibiotics are still around there, and it can lead to antibiotic resistance, and eventually, as you're going to see how this stuff moves through the food chain, and eventually it does get into human populations as well. So we'll try and go through some of these things. In low-income countries, of course, most of the food is locally produced. The difficulty that you have there with it is that although the small-scale production is very useful and the short distance for distribution also makes it relatively safe, it's often offset by a lack of hygiene in terms of people. They often don't even have enough water to actually wash their hands properly and things like that before they prepare or eat the foods. And also there are virtually no regulations in a number of these countries in terms of the stuff. So you really don't know what you're getting. And again, it's really just you have to be careful in terms of how you prepare and cook the food. If you prepare food properly and cook it properly, there should really be very little problem. So despite what you're going to hear about some of this stuff, our food is actually amazingly safe. You saw the numbers of people that died, the numbers of estimated cases that you might get with it. But I just remind you that although not everybody in the world is able to eat every day, there are billions of people within the world who do eat every day. And when you think of the amount of food that is consumed and the number of meals that are consumed on a daily basis, in actual fact, the number of people who get sick from eating that food is really very, very tiny. The only thing that we're concerned about, of course, is that if it is in the food chain and a lot of people are eating that same food, then it does potentially expose a lot of people to a risk in terms of the food. Well, I mean, what I'm saying is that the number of times that it causes acute disease due to an infectious organism is very small. In terms of the long-term complications, in terms of all the toxins and all the other stuff that are in the food, we're not touching that one tonight. We're just dealing with the other stuff, and I'm not going there. So what we're really talking about is we're talking about the infections that you might get in food. And so the organisms that are likely to be involved in that, the types of microbes that we deal with are either bacteria or fungi or parasites or viruses. I'm just going to do one of my little things here that drives me nuts, is when people confuse viruses and bacteria. Because biologically and the way they cause disease and how they live and all the rest of the stuff is so totally different than bacteria. And yet the number of times I hear the E. coli virus or the Listeria virus, it's not, it's a bacteria. And the real difference with them is a bacterium is able to live on its own. It can live and multiply and do stuff all on its own. It's got all of the equipment available to it to be able to grow and multiply. A virus can't do that. It has to get into a cell that allows the virus to take over that cell and make millions and billions of other virus particles. On its own, a virus can't do anything. So it's just like a little shell of protein with either DNA or RNA in it. It can't do a thing until it gets into cells and be able to do stuff. Bacteria, fungi, parasites, they're free living. They don't need anything else to be able to keep living. So we don't need to get into all of the biology of it, but trust me, viruses are very different from bacteria. Food poisoning is actually a poor term. And we always hear about food poisoning. True poisoning is from consuming something which may be food, contaminated by toxins, which could be either a chemical or they could be microbial in origin. So that's the true poisoning that you're getting. Food-associated infections are probably a much better term to use for what we commonly talk about as food poisoning. And those occur when the food is the vehicle for the ingestion of a microbial organism, either a parasite or a virus or bacterium or a fungus, where it's the vehicle that we eat that, the organism then establishes itself in us, it multiplies, and then it causes disease for us. And it's an important idea. Now, some of the things with food poisoning, there are some true food poisonings that are caused by bacteria, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. But in general, really what it means is that the importance of it is that if you ingest food that's contaminated with a preformed toxin, you get a rapid onset of symptoms. So this is the one where, you go out, you have a lovely dinner, you come home, you go to bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're up, throwing up and sitting on the toilet and all the rest of that stuff. That's almost certainly an acute poisoning. The other ones that you get are usually days or hours later, or days or maybe sometimes even weeks after you've actually ingested the food, because the organism has to actually evade all of the things that your body is trying to do to get rid of them. Then they have to be able to multiply and begin to cause the disease, and that takes time for them to do that. So the acute kind of true poisoning happens not that commonly. The classical examples of preformed toxins that bacteria have are things like the Clostridium, and the ones you've probably heard of are things like tetanus, which you don't get from food poisoning. Of course, it's usually from a wound, from an old rusty nail or something like that that you actually get. But the one you probably have heard of is botulism. And botulism, actually, botulus is a sausage in Latin. And the organism, the Clostridium, is oftentimes in meat. You often find it in meat. And if the meat has been prepared or stored improperly, the little Clostridium organism can grow in there. It releases its toxin in the food, and then the organism actually stops growing, and it'll form a little spore, but the toxin is already in the meat usually. And then when you eat that, then a few hours later you begin to get sick with it. Staphylococci are very common. They actually tend to love dairy products and cream products. So you often find staphylococcal poisoning when individuals have, that lovely Boston cream pie that somebody made, and they were, all these lovely little peaks of cream that they've got in the top there, but it wasn't absolutely perfect, and so you just touch it with your finger, just poke it up there a little bit, and then somebody gets in the phone, you forget to put it in the fridge or this, that, or the other stuff, and it sits out there for a few hours. And then what happens, of course, is the organisms that you inoculated just in that spot, they then produce this toxin, and it's then released just in that area. And that's why you can have a slice of that Boston cream pie and not be sick, but the person who got the slice next to you that had the finger poked in the pie, they can sure get sick with it, because the toxin stays very locally when you're doing it. And then the other common one is Bacillus cereus, cereus as in C-E-R-E-U-S, cereals, so rice in particular is where you actually find it in, and oftentimes you'll find it with reheated rice, where you'll actually, if it's not done properly, then you get that preformed toxin again, and shortly after ingesting that, you often experience vomiting and diarrhea when you get those. So those are the three big ones. With the Clostridial toxin, this is botulism, and the infant botulism is one of the things that you see. And it used to be that, the most recent outbreak, which was a good long while ago, actually came from unpasteurized honey. And people were giving it to the baby because they thought it was a good natural product and what have you, and gave it to babies. And it just so happened that the honey was actually, it was contaminated with botulism. And so the babies get floppy and what have you, and it's not a nice disease. Fungi can actually also have preformed toxins as well. So ergot poisoning used to be called St. Anthony's fire. And ergots are the things that are actually used for treating migraine headaches. We use ergots and ergotamine for actually treating that. It causes a spasm of the arteries. And so when people ate this moldy rye, it usually was, they would actually get a spasm of the arteries, particularly in the fingers, and it would cause a tremendous burning in the extremities because they were getting gangrene in terms of what was going on there. So it was called St. Anthony's fire. And then aflatoxins. Aflatoxins are nasty ones. Now they're not an acute, they're a nasty toxin. They don't cause an acute illness unless you've had a huge amount of it. But it is something that actually ends up damaging the liver and can actually cause cancer of the liver. And it's very common in peanuts that have actually been contaminated with a fungus. And so if you look at any peanut butter thing, it'll tell you that there's no aflatoxin in it or what have you, or they'll tell you that the aflatoxins that are in there are below danger levels or whatever. So again, and it's usually just as a consequence of storing the stuff where the fungus gets in and creates some trouble. That's just what ergot looks like on rye, and that's the aflatoxin stuff on peanuts. It looks sort of like little mushrooms and what have you growing. Remember, there are all sorts of different food types, and depending on what kinds of food that you're looking at, it can give you a clue as to what kind of organism is maybe involved. So we've got meats and fish, and the fish would of course include shellfish. Shellfish are a little bit of a problem because, as you know, they particularly things like mussels and oysters, they filter large amounts of water to be able to take any organic material out of the water so that they can actually grow. So anything that happens to be in the water, they will actually concentrate it within themselves. And so when you're eating mussels or oysters, I mean, I really enjoy eating raw oysters, and I have been very lucky because it's not really a question of how many oysters do you have to eat until you get sick. You will eventually get sick if you eat raw oysters. There's no way that you won't. But that shouldn't deter you from enjoying them if you really like it. Obviously, eggs and dairy are another group, and we mentioned that the staphylococci are one of the things in it, but they're, in terms of eggs, you can get salmonella or some other things in there. The grains we already mentioned, there are some things that can contaminate the grains, and then of course fruits and vegetables. Do remember that water is extremely important whenever you're going in the whole process of whether you're growing, harvesting, washing it, sorting it, doing all the rest of the stuff. The source of the water is very important because if the water is not very clean, then you will contaminate the vegetables and things that you're actually washing with that water. And you'll see what can happen with it. So water is often an important vehicle for contaminating some of the foods. Shellfish poisoning, I mean, never mind about all these different toxins. The vast majority of them are actually because of algal blooms or toxic algal blooms that occur in the areas where the shellfish are. They will often ingest them, and they then get that incorporated into them. And when you eat those, you may get any one of these strange and wonderful kinds of things from shellfish or some of the seafood. Somebody told me, and I don't know, it may be an apocryphal type of story, but when you're down in the islands and there's lots of different fish, not just shellfish, that can have some of these toxins, it can be very difficult to know whether or not they are actually, when somebody brings in the fish catch, whether the thing is actually going to be safe to eat. And I'm told that many of the really good restaurants, there are lots and lots of feral cats that are running around outside, and so they do basically, the cook does what is called a cat test, if you will, or a cat scan, if you like, and they just simply cut a bit of the fish off and throw it out, and the cat eats it. And if the cat's still alive when you're getting ready to prepare the evening meal, then you're pretty sure that the food is probably okay. So I don't know whether that's true or not, and it sounds terrible, but who knows? So again, we were talking then about production, harvest, sorting, washing, transport, and storage, and in any one of those situations, you'll be able to see that there are times that you can actually contaminate food, or whether it's any kind of food. It all goes through the same kind of processing, and you'll be able to see that there are all sorts of things that can be problematic. This is a field, or several fields. You can see they're fairly large fields. You can see there's a fairly large number of workers in those fields. Is there anything you notice that's missing in that field?
Machinery.
Well, there's no machinery, no, but that's right, because you've got all the people that are doing the job. What do people have to do?
Nobody's wearing gloves?
Oh, no, they wouldn't be wearing gloves. Those would be much too expensive. There's no washrooms, right. There's no porta potties. There's no nothing. And there's no way you can wash your hands and what have you. And if you're out there in the fields from dawn to dusk picking strawberries or this, that, and the other stuff, you can bet your life you're going to have to go to the bathroom sometime during the day. And if you've got no place to wash your hands and you've got no place to all the rest of the stuff, then you can guarantee that after you've had to do your business and carry on picking those strawberries or raspberries or what have you, those raspberries are going to certainly, and strawberries are going to have some stuff on them. It may not be enough to cause any problem. But you can imagine that it's one of the areas. So a lot of places now, if you look, that use field laborers to do this in many countries, you'll actually see that they do have washroom facilities there for them. But of course, in many other countries, they don't. And so you do have to be careful in terms of that particular kind of thing. So the kinds of other problems that you get with it, we mentioned the lack of field sanitation, the irrigation water that's used for actually growing the crops and what have you. If it's grossly contaminated with all sorts of either animal or human fecal material, and you're spraying that water on, then obviously if it's going on lettuces and things like that, and green peppers and what have you, they may well actually get contaminated at that time with the irrigation water. And of course the type of manure and how you use it. In many countries they use what is called night soil when they're actually dealing with the vegetables, and that is basically just human manure that is taken out and put on the fields. And so of course human manure may have human type diseases in it, and the organisms, although they don't necessarily live for a long time in the soil because they're not meant to live in the soil, depending on how they do, they may be able to survive that. And again, if you happen to be the unlucky person, then you could get into some trouble with it. We mentioned the wash water and the handling. Usually once the initial processing is done, the stuff is picked, it's usually washed, then it's weighed, it's usually transported. And depending on how far away those fields are from where it actually gets to the initial warehouse before it gets put in refrigerated trucks or whatever and then sent off to big central sorting areas, sometimes what happens is if you want to sell your produce, it better look good. You know, every time that you go to Loblaws or what have you, you know, and it always happens to me, I just reach for those beautiful green onions and that damn spray comes on all over the place. It covers me with water. And it's because if you keep them nice and plump, you know, they don't look shriveled up, they don't look miserable. So you put a lot of water on them. So just imagine you're in a hot country, you've got a whole crop of this, that, and the other stuff. You got to drive it 200 kilometers to be able to get to the place where you're going to sell it. You obviously want that to be nice and wet on the way there so that the stuff doesn't begin to shrink up and shrivel, and you may just stop and grab water from wherever you can along the road and spread it over that stuff. And it will keep the crop looking good, and then you get a better price for it when you actually get it to wherever you're selling it from. So wash water is important. And again, in the final processing, there's wash water, and there's also cross-contamination, because as we mentioned, you may have food coming from many different places, but it comes to one big central place where it's all processed and then redistributed out. And so if you've got contamination from one source, it's mixed with others that maybe weren't contaminated, and of course you can get the cross-contamination at that time, and then the whole load will be in trouble. How are we doing here, Nicole? I'll speed up a bit. So again, we've talked a bit about some of the transportation, distribution. Storage is always a problem. There's a lot of spoilage that can happen. We have to use a lot of energy to keep stuff refrigerated and all the rest of the stuff so it doesn't spoil. So storage is really important, and if you don't have the appropriate storage, then the food will spoil, and you may not know that. When you're preparing it, cooking it, and then storing it, and then reheating it, any of these things can lead to problems. Just a little bit to let you see how things can get from one kind of vehicle into another and cause problems. You've all heard of this E. coli 015787, or the E. coli stuff. It was first found around about 1985 in hamburger or meat, and it used to be called hamburger disease. And that was primarily because people were eating hamburgers that had been contaminated with this particular E. coli, and people were not cooking it properly on the barbecue, and we'll come back to that in a minute, how you can solve that one. It stayed, and it was still called hamburger disease, but in actual fact, by about 1993, if you start looking at when these big outbreaks of E. coli actually happened, you see 1993, apple cider, 1995, leaf lettuce, 96, leaf lettuce again, 1996, apple juice, and then 2000, and from then on, it actually became what is really a waterborne disease. And so what happened was this stuff really started off in the cattle, and it really was only in meat products. But of course the cattle would, in these large feedlots and all the rest of it, many of them would actually have this organism present. The cattle don't get sick from this organism, but they would of course excrete it in the manure. If that manure is then spread on fields, you get runoff. If you've got into problems with water, etc., it can eventually get into the water supply. So here was a disease that started off as a foodborne disease, but ended up as being more commonly now related to our water. And so it's one of the things that we're concerned about in terms of water. I just put this up here now. Why is it that if you're barbecuing a nice steak like this, you can eat it rare, and you won't likely get E. coli from it, but you do get E. coli from the hamburger that's rare? Any ideas? Not quite.
More air in a month?
You're getting close. You're getting, yeah?
From the processing machine?
No.
The way they do it in the slaughter?
Well, it's slightly related to that. I mean, it's the carcass that is contaminated at the time, right? Because something has gone wrong with that, and so the carcass is contaminated. If you grind the meat up, you're going to create a tremendous amount of surface area within that hamburger, and some of that ground up meat that was on the surface is the thing that's contaminated, but when you grind it all up and put it up together, it means that the E. coli could be any place through there. So that when you make your hamburger patty, if you don't cook it all the way through, you could still have some E. coli in there. A steak, on the other hand, it's on the surface. And so when you sear the steak on both sides properly, then you've actually gotten rid of the E. coli. It doesn't penetrate down through into the meat, whereas with hamburger, you've already mixed it all up so it goes all the way through. So it's relatively safe to eat steak that is barbecued reasonably rare, but it is not so safe to try and eat hamburgers that are rare. Better to cook them all the way through. This is another disease that we virtually never see anymore. There's trichinosis that you used to find in pork. It was caused by eating measly pork. Mostly our food inspections and the way that we kill pigs and the way we raise pigs and how we butcher them and how they're inspected have virtually eliminated trichinosis from our kind of thing. The last time we had any trouble with that was a few years ago when somebody decided that they were going to raise wild boar in a place outside of Toronto. And the wild boars, of course, the pigs, wild pigs and what have you, got trichinosis because they eat rats. And rats have trichinosis and this, that, and the other stuff. And of course, the boars did that, and they had this wonderful, fantastic banquet where they served beautiful, thin sliced, rare wild boar, and a whole bunch of people got trichinosis with it. But normally we don't. Normally we wouldn't see that. Listeria, as we mentioned, it's a pretty innocuous-looking organism. It doesn't look like a whole heck of a lot. There are certain high-risk groups of it. Most of us sitting in this room aren't really at a very high risk of even if we ate some Listeria, it wouldn't probably cause us too much trouble. Pregnant women are a little bit susceptible to it. They may get something like a flu-like illness, but the problem is that the organism may cross the placenta and actually infect the baby when they're pregnant. And then when the baby is born, the baby can have a bloodstream infection or meningitis from it. And so that's really the reason why we're really bothered about things like Listeria. In adults, if you're elderly, like me, and if you have diabetes, which I don't have, or alcoholism, which I don't have, or any kind of cancers or things like this and under chemotherapy, if you're immunocompromised in any kind of way, we have difficulty dealing with the Listeria organism. And so it can be problematic that way. But at any age, what we're most likely to get if we ate something that was contaminated with Listeria, we just get maybe a very mild gastroenteritis, a little bit of diarrhea, or we may get nothing at all. And Listeria is commonly found in a whole host of things. You can find it in meats. You find it in the unpasteurized cheeses, some of those lovely creamy blue cheeses that you get, you know, that are made in Quebec or made in France that taste so wonderful. Many of those are unpasteurized, and they do pose a certain risk. You can find it in vegetables, usually as a result of the vegetable being contaminated by something, by Listeria, that may be some sort of, may have been in the manure that was actually dealing with that. And you can also find it in seafood, so it's quite ubiquitous. You can find it pretty near anywhere. It likes the cold. So just keeping things in the fridge doesn't actually stop it from growing all that much. It quite likes the cold. Usually we find it if you just went around and tested everybody in a population, you'd find 1 to 5% of people would carry the organism. If you worked in an abattoir, as a slaughterhouse, it would be higher. And the thing is, if you've got this thing and you're the person that's preparing the food in the family, then your other family members can also sort of get that too. It just sort of goes out there. I apologize, I've never been able to, with PowerPoints, put in the actual superscript. I've never learned how to do that. So this 10e to the 5 is 10 to the exponential 5, or 100,000. So we would normally expect to see about 0.7 cases per 100,000 in a year of Listeria. And if you look at London, which is about 400,000 people, that would be 4 times 0.7, which is 2.8, or 3 cases a year, and that's roughly what we see in London in our lab. We'll isolate Listeria about 3 times a year in the lab, so it holds there. It has a case fatality rate of about 35% if you get one of the serious infections with it, and it's worse as you get older. If you get it when you get older, then it can be more serious. So in terms of bioterrorism, and I'm going to wind up with this pretty soon because I've got to finish in 45 minutes. Is that what you're telling me?
You can have until 8.
I can have until 8. Oh, well, we'll see how it goes. Everybody seems to be still sort of, at least I'm not seeing too many people falling asleep yet, but we'll see. So, I mean, what would be the purpose of terrorism? You know, there's been lots of deliberate poisonings in the past. If you go back through history, you'll find when people were in the medieval times and they would lay a city to siege or something like this, they would often try and starve them out, or if they could, they'd poison the food going in or something like that, and it would make it easier to actually get that. There were all sorts of funny techniques to avoid poisoning. Many of the kings and queens, they would have tasters so that they would, you know, they would let them eat it and see what happened, and if they survived, you know, then fine, I'll probably eat the food. The Chinese supposedly, the ivory chopsticks, or some of those beautiful ivory chopsticks, in some of the common poisons that were used, the chopsticks will actually turn black. And I think that was really just with arsenic or something like that, but they were often used. That was one of the things that people used that kind of stuff for. So they were always looking for whether you're going to be poisoned or not. And there are all sorts of techniques to avoid poisoning, and you had to have somebody who you really trusted preparing the food. If you ever found somebody else at the banquet that died or what have you as a result of how bad a chef you had, then you simply executed them and got another one. And why did it become less popular in terms of doing this stuff? Well, I mean, pretty soon it became fairly easy to detect that somebody had actually poisoned it, and they could point the finger at you and say, you did this. And so you didn't get away with it anymore. So if you're going to do something like this, you'd want to try and hide it so that you wouldn't actually get caught by doing it. So what kind of goals might you actually achieve if you're working on agriculture or trying to poison a food supply? Well, obviously you want to attack the enemy's food supply. Why bother? I mean, we've got all sorts of bombs and rockets and all sorts of other dreadful things. Why would you waste the time waiting to get into all the business of their food supply? We like wars over as quickly as we can, and so we throw everything at them. So I don't think it would work that way. You could destabilize a government by creating food shortages or unemployment. We seem to be able to do that quite well on our own. There are lots and lots of countries with unstable governments and food supply shortages, so there's no need to actually do it for that reason. You could alter supply and demand for a commodity if you wanted to, but again, usually people are watching out for that in the futures market, and you get charged with insider trading or something like that. So I'm not really sure why it would work, but everybody seems terribly concerned about bioterrorism in our food. Obviously, you could look at just doing it at food from local sources, but that's not likely going to get you the kind of terror that you want to instill in people. You could also look from food from sources from further away, and that might have a bit of an advantage. You could poison something in Chile, for instance, and then it wouldn't actually, it would be somebody in North America or a group of people in North America that maybe got sick, and you might not know that the food came from Chile. It makes it less likely that you'd get caught. Or you could go for food from distant sources or exotic foods. But again, if you're going to go for exotic foods are usually only eaten by an exotic few number of people. And so, I mean, terrorism is supposed to strike terror into the community, so I'm not sure that it would work all that well. Again, when you look at it, where would be the time or place that you could actually do this? We've gone through most of this stuff before, but production and storage standards, you have to make sure and those places are safe, because it's relatively easy in actual fact. Most of the places where we store our food are not in actual fact kept under a great deal of surveillance or any of this kind of stuff, and so it would be relatively easy to get in there and contaminate food. Inspections are okay, but because some of the food, if you're going to do this, you'd want to do it on a very large scale. It would be extremely difficult to be able to inspect everything. So you have to, usually with inspections, you pick and choose. So you'll take, you know, 1 out of every 100 sacks of grain or something like that if you were going to do it. You can't do them all, obviously. Education is important, I suppose, and we can monitor stuff based on epidemiology, and so you'd have to be a little bit careful in terms of what you're actually going to do, otherwise you might get caught. We've got a lot of things that have changed in production. The epidemiology, which is just the way that diseases are caused, we've certainly mentioned that those have changed in terms of some of the foodborne diseases now becoming waterborne diseases. So the epidemiology is changing. You'd have to try and get that right. And we've dealt, I think, with some of the inspections and surveillance and education. We've talked about some of the risks in terms of what is going on here. We've mentioned that food is produced in many different countries, and many countries have very different standards in terms of how food is grown, collected, etc., etc. The biodiversity of crops has been reduced, And I'm now not talking so much about bioterrorism, but just our whole food supply in terms of how vulnerable it might be. As we get less and less biodiversity and more monocultures where everything is optimized so you've only got one particular kind of thing, it means that if you do have a disease that's capable of getting into that crop, it may well destroy the entire crop because everything is the same, just like the Irish potato famine. And you know, when you use one variety of potatoes and you only use the one variety of potatoes, if you do get a disease that will affect that particular strain or species of potato, you can be in trouble. And we're doing an awful lot of this monoculture now. We are really and truly trying to make everything just be the same. And there's a lot of groups around that are trying to promote biodiversity. And you probably remember that there's some places, they're going back to the Andes now where potatoes came from, where there are 200 or 300 different varieties of potatoes. And they're trying to get rootstock or seed stock from all of those, and they're storing them up in the Arctic so that if we do get into trouble, we may be able to go back there and get some of those varieties back out again and be able to have potatoes that will grow again. We talked a little bit about the standards and storage and distribution. I don't really want to get into the epidemiology of all of these things. It's difficult. It's getting more and more difficult and complex to track these things on a worldwide basis. And it's requiring more and more sophisticated methodologies to be able to go through and find out what's actually happening with our food. So we've talked about where our food is vulnerable at the monocultures, soil contamination, and that sort of relates a little bit to your earlier question in terms of, you know, the toxins that will get into our food with soil contamination. You've already heard some of the stuff that people are talking about with the Japanese food that's been growing around where the nuclear reactor is. And if indeed there's contamination of the soils there, that may well get into the food. And it could accumulate and could get into problems. I'm not suggesting that it is that way at the moment, but certainly from what was learned from Chernobyl, that did indeed cause some troubles in terms of food soil contamination. We do a lot of crop spraying. We add a lot of things to food. And you remember not that long ago there was the stuff with the powdered milk or the baby formula in China where they'd cut it with melamine. Because it actually made it look as though there was a higher protein content. But of course melamine was toxic and babies got into trouble. The Chinese, as you know, managed to deal with that. They just simply executed the guy who ran the company. We tend not to do that. When we get, when our guys contaminate our food supply, so long as they come out and say that they're really sorry that they did that and they'll try not to do it again, we tend to give them another chance. And obviously, we mentioned the business of storage and transport. Distribution, we've talked about that until we just go nuts. If you were actually, I'm just going to go back to bioterrorism for a second now. So given all those various things, if you were going to do this, what organisms would you use? Well, you need to make it look as though it could be a natural event. The organism needs to be hardy and it has to be easily handled. You'd need a food that is eaten raw or an organism or toxin that resists cooking, and there are things that you could do for that. But really, why bother at all? And we mentioned some of the reasons why you wouldn't really bother doing it. By far and away the most successful attempt at bioterrorism in terms of getting people worried about food supply. If you remember, we're a group a number of years ago who really wanted to get at the butterball turkey industry, and they basically said that they contaminated butterball turkeys. And they didn't do it. They just said they did. And so long as the media believes it and you believes it, then nobody bought butterball turkeys, and the poor guys who produced butterball turkeys went broke. Because so in actual fact, oftentimes all you need to do is have a credible threat, and that will work just as well as if you actually do the deed. There are a few things in terms of why something like food may be reasonable to look at for doing it. There are no real technical obstacles to getting an organism that you could put in the food. They're not that dangerous to handle. They're not difficult. You don't need special labs or things. You could do it quite easily. There's a lot of low security, as we mentioned, in terms of a number of the targets. It's quite easy to get at some of the food supply things. It's a low moral barrier to cross. I'm told, I don't know this, but I'm told that if you're going to stab somebody, it's not very pleasant for you or them either. But I mean, you've got a high moral barrier to cross. You're close to them, you get covered in blood, it's really awful. A gun is a little bit easier because you can shoot somebody from across the room, or if it's a rifle, you can shoot them from a long way away, and it's not quite so bad. And if you're poisoning somebody's food supply, again, it's a long way away and you're not really too bothered about it. So it's easier to actually do that. I'm going to be done in a minute. I'll get your question in a second.
You know what I want to say.
Yeah, probably. To get the maximum effect and get people really terrified, you don't need that many cases. Look at what happened with something like anthrax. You know, people went nuts. And there were only a very small number of cases of anthrax, and we spent billions of dollars trying to make sure that nobody got anthrax through the mail. So you actually don't need to contaminate large amounts of food or create a large number of deaths. You just need a few, and then say I did it, and you know then you're okay. And preferably you say I did it, and you're protected by being stuck in the middle of somewhere where nobody can get at you. And you can make it look as though it mimics natural causes. The groups that might be involved in this kinds of thing, I mean, I think this is all speculation. I don't think anybody really does this, but if you look at the lists about who might do what to you, countries, corporations, organized crime, terrorist groups, or individuals may decide that they would like to do this. I actually think our food supply is probably quite safe. In terms of bioterrorism, I doubt that there's too many people that are actually going to do that. I'm much more concerned about ecological disturbances or natural disturbances that will disrupt our food chain, and it will make everything a lot more difficult and a lot more vulnerable. And we ourselves will have to be a lot more careful in terms of how we prepare, sort, store, and do all the things that we need to do with our food. And I think that's just about it. Yeah, I'm all done. So I can take some questions.